welcome to the latest edition of Paul Walsh Talks Advocacy and Influence. I am delighted today to be joined by my former boss, Brandon Michener. We worked together at the European Business Aviation Association for, I think, just under a year. Brandon Michener is a strategic communications consultant, a lot of experience in Brussels. Tell us a bit about yourself, Brandon. What's your company? What are you doing? What value do you bring to your clients?
Yeah. First of all, it's nice to see you again and join this podcast. I've been listening to some of them before. So I help association clients communicate better, and on my website it says I help people make better decisions. This means both clients but also journalists make better decisions on what to cover, how to cover it. Also public institutions make better decisions in public policy terms. So I like to think that everything that I'm doing is helping people make better decisions internally and externally.
And so what framework do you use to help them do this, or what experience have you gone through in order to really provide that type of advice?
Yeah. Well, I like to think that my experience as a journalist, so the first 15 years of my professional experience, I was a journalist, and it's the job of a journalist to make everything simple for a very general audience. Whereas a lot of the people talking, particularly in Brussels, are trying to explain things which are extremely complicated and not always succeeding at doing that in a simple way. So the work of a journalist is essentially to consolidate all of this highly technical information and try to simplify it in terms that your editor's mother can understand, as a BBC reporter once told me.
And what's the link between that and decision making?
If you don't anticipate the needs of the audience, whether that's, let's say, the media or whether that's the general public and voters, you can set yourself up for failure. We've seen this in the EU with some recent initiatives which sounded really good to the people who were behind them in Brussels, but just completely fell flat on the market. We've seen some Green Deal initiatives which have since been scrapped. We've seen some regulatory initiatives which have since been scrapped. And because they are often driven by very special interests, and nobody steps way back like a journalist would and asks the big picture question, is this really necessary? Does this really make sense?
And the culprit here is the people who are making things too complex.
Yes.
Fine. I like this way of looking at it because it means that you can cover a lot of different domains within the activities that are quite common within the Brussels bubble. So it's not just communications, it's communications and public affairs. Yeah. And so this is the foundation. I mean, are there other elements that contribute to a degree of dysfunctionality in Brussels and which result in bad decisions?
It's a good question. I'm tempted to say there's a lot of dysfunctionality that leads to bad decisions. On the one hand, you've got a bunch of member states, each with their own agendas, and sometimes one single member state can put sufficient pressure on the Commission to do something, which was never really popular with the others to begin with. And then as soon as people start to understand what the bigger member state is proposing, it's usually a bigger member state that has this kind of sway, then they face pushback. So that's one thing. There's even the structure of the European Commission with these vice presidents who might be responsible for several departments can create problems where you may have one department which opposes a decision and another department that supports it, both reporting to the same commissioner. So the dissenting DG, let's say, isn't allowed to actually say what it thinks because their commissioner will support another DG that he's responsible, or she.
Is this something that can be traced back to Brexit, or has this gotten worse as a result of the fact that we don't have this pragmatic British voice in EU policymaking anymore? I
definitely think that Britain is missed, especially on topics related to scientific decision making. The Brits have an amazing scientific tradition and pushing for evidence-based decision making. And we've already seen, for example, since Brexit, that they've said they're going to go their own way on genetically modified organisms and gene editing because Europe was too slow and potentially antediluvian in the approach to those technologies. So I think, generally speaking, yes. Whether it applies to all topics or just scientific topics, I'm not competent to say.
Okay, fine. Now, you've been looking at this so far from the point of view of the dysfunctionality within EU policymaking. That's not necessarily an excuse for people who support companies in their public affairs outreach or people at associations to be dysfunctional as well, right? So what do you think needs to be addressed in this part of Brussels?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, I mean, it's in the nature of associations like the Commission that each member has a say. Sometimes each member has a veto, which is an issue that needs to be addressed. You can't say it's a problem if it's built in and it's in the bylaws. It's just the way it is. But it means that associations have to spend an extraordinary amount of time trying to find consensus before they can agree on a strategy and implement that strategy. And a communications person is not usually the deciding voice in the room, but can help them make better decisions in this way by acting as an internal sounding board to say, this is the reaction that you're going to get when you go out with that.
Often in the statutes, the rule-making procedures, decision-making procedures will be based on a majority, based on a vote. But often this is not respected in the actual discussions. So are you saying, don't worry about consensus? Do things based on a vote?
No, not at all. I think especially in the industry associations, consensus is important. That doesn't mean, 100% consensus. I think there are occasions where if there's only one member who disagrees with the decision, they can put a asterisk and a footnote saying, we agree with this, except for member X. And I've actually had situations where that was the case, and it's a way around the impasse. But generally speaking, it's important for everyone to agree that they can have their own company or member views, but they need to compromise in order to have an association view which is impactful and effective. Otherwise, there's no point being in the association to begin with if you're just doing things to undermine the ability of the association to be effective.
I think what this often comes down to is leadership on behalf of the people in the Secretariat who have the gravitas to be able to convince the members to get on board with a position that is actually impactful, and they're not really playing a more administrative role, which often results to a race to the bottom on a lowest denominator decision making.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Good. But as a communications advisor, can you help associations deal with this part of their decision-making process, or is it something that you just really have to work around and so on when you're
No, I think you can. One thing that I said is, for example, to include communications from the start. So communications advisors should be included in strategic decision-making discussions and not just left to implement things that have already been decided. That's one thing. So they can act as this internal sounding board and an internal reality check on how decisions or statements might be perceived outside of the four walls of the association. A communications advisor with some experience can also just talk about things like timing. There may be something which will be more impactful on a Wednesday than on a Thursday. If the commission, for example, has just come out with a decision, the communications advisor will say, "There's no point coming out with a statement 3 days later." Ideally, the statement should be prepared in advance in multiple versions, depending on different scenarios, depending on the importance of the situation. You might want to have also audio and video statements prepared in order to give those to the media, the second the decision is announced and you've understood which scenario it relates to. So there's all kinds of things that you can do to help the associations do a better job of communicating.
Okay, because I think what we often see is a sort of hierarchy at associations where you have people at public affairs on the higher end of that hierarchy and people in communications who are looked upon as just as a support, so not involved in the initial discussions and really just people who are turned to at the last minute to get a press release out to support a particular position.
Yeah, but I could give you a really simple example from, I won't name the client, but, many of my clients are very technical people, technical in the sense of lawyers, or technical in the sense of engineers, and they just think differently. If you are a lawyer, for example, trying to make a case in court, and you might have multiple counts against you, and you need to respond to each of those counts. And let's say the commission or the parliament or the council has done something you don't like. Well, you feel the lawyer in that person will feel obligated to respond to each and every individual point. From a communications perspective, this is an absolute disaster. You want to focus on 3 points, ideally 1 point. If everything can be distilled into one high priority point, this is the one thing which is existential, make or break. You can't lose on that one. Then put everything on that, or at least don't make it more than 3 points, because people just don't remember more than 3 points. If you try to explain them to a journalist, they're going to cut you off after the first point anyway. So, it's important to try to convince these subject matter experts that you can add value to the discussion by telling them which of the 12 things they want to say will actually be heard.
Is there an issue with the talent pipeline going into the world of advocacy in Brussels, where people often come from a law background or come from a politics background, but really what they find themselves doing is what I think is fundamentally a communications role. And it seems like they're figuring that out as they go along. It's not like they've done a 4-year degree course on how to do communications well, how to do policy communications well. I'm not even sure if that degree course even exists, but that is the job that they have at the end of the day. Yeah. And maybe the reason that a lot of us are not good at this is because it's not something that we've ever really even been trained in.
Yeah, I think you've hit it right on the nail. That's absolutely the case in Brussels. There's a lot of lawyers in particular, but also others who are put into jobs for which they maybe technically 100% competent, fantastic people, but they need to learn the external communications aspect on the job. And what I've always said is there's not a whole lot of difference between media relations and public policy advocacy. You're passing messages to an audience. There just might be different audiences. One will have a greater degree of expertise in the topic than the other, but you're basically trying to convey your messages in a way that will convince people and win them over to your side.
Yeah. I mean, it's not hugely complex. I think that, the first part of it is just to be able to be self-aware enough and recognize that there's a kind of a new kind of skill set, a new way of looking at things that you need to develop.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the issues with Brussels is that at the senior end, you may get people with lots and lots of experience in their domain, so subject matter experts who also need to understand the way that the Commission works. So they may be a subject matter expert in the automotive industry, for example, but the decisions in the Commission are made on a collegiate basis. So there may be trade aspects to the decision, there may be employment aspects to the decision, there may be technology aspects to the decision. So they need to understand that they need to reach out to all these different parts of the Commission or the Parliament or the Council, whoever it is, and operate on multiple levels. And on the pure PR end of the scale, most of the good communicators in Brussels are probably either journalists or former journalists, and there are quite a few people who end up doing communications who were never really trained for that, as you said. They might have been an intern in the Commission, and or a native English speaker, and that's somehow qualifies them to be a spokesperson. Usually not, but this is good business for consultants.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, it's clear that there's a big need for this thing, so it must be wonderful to be in a position of a strategic communications advisor in Brussels. Do you select certain subject matter areas that you focus on? Do you have certain specialties, or are there areas that you prefer to focus on than others?
Well, since I run my own company, I have the luxury of being able to choose my clients. So I've worked for bigger consultancies before where that was less the case, but now I'm focused almost entirely on technology with my my clients. I've also got a pro bono project, which is completely different. We can talk about later, but I've often been focused on technology, whether it was working in the aviation space. There were technology aspects having to do with CO2 reductions, for example, or flying cars, as we're not supposed to call them, but I love that. Now I'm working on vaccine and animal health technology, as well as connected cars, as well as the connectivity standards that make your mobile phone something more than a music player and a camera, and that type of thing.
Are you able to join the dots between a policy success story where you were involved in a campaign that really helped to change a policy or resulted in an amendment that was important for your client? Can you join the dots between that type of a success story and good communications practices that you implemented?
I would certainly like to think so. A measurement of success in public affairs is a whole chapter in itself, or a whole book in itself. But we have an example this week exactly with one of my clients, IP Europe, which stands for Intellectual Property Europe. The Commission withdrew a proposal that it had advanced a couple of years ago called the Standard Essential Patents Regulation. The topic is complicated, but essentially has to do with the balance of power in licensing negotiations between people who invent technologies and the people who later license those technologies in order to implement them in a device like a smartphone, a mobile, a car, or a HD television. And it's extremely rare that the Commission will just withdraw a proposal. take a lot of time to prepare these proposals, doing consultations, impact assessments and the like. They put forward their proposal. In this case, it had already been through Parliament, which had approved the Commission's approach, but there was a lack of consensus, to state maybe an understatement, in the Council. And the Commission concluded that it was unlikely that this would be approved in its current form. So they were going to withdraw the proposal and revisit it.
That happened?
Luckily, this happened 2 days ago.
Okay.
And the connection to communications is this is exactly what IP Europe, the Business Association, has been saying for the last 2 years. They said from the very day that this Commission proposal was published that it was going to be an own goal for Europe. And we spent some time thinking about how to take this very complicated subject and describe it in a way that people could understand. The football terminology own goal sort of lent itself because we thought that this was not going to score any points for the home team as the Commission had intended, but instead was actually going to hurt the home team and serve the interests of other trading partners, let's say China or the United States. So we ran a campaign for a year all around that very simple theme of the own goal with football imagery. And I would like to believe that helped contribute to the success.
Did you align that communications aspect of the campaign with more kind of face-to-face traditional public affairs approach as well?
Absolutely. So the own goal was mostly focused on the Parliament, where we had 700 plus MEPs to convince, it really boils down to a couple of committees, but ultimately everyone has a vote. So we wanted to make sure that everyone would understand why this issue was important and why it was important to vote in a way that would protect innovation and patent innovation in Europe. And
I guess the timing helped as well.
The timing
New
helped
commission
as well.
and the focuses
so,
of this
but let's say the traditional lobbying of face-to-face meetings and discussions with permanent representations with people in the member state capitals, I mean, that went on all along.
Okay. So we spoke about the challenges that, for instance, the Commission faces in kind of communicating complex topics in a simple way. I feel like the US administration right now doesn't have that same problem. Donald Trump is able to cut right through the noise.
Yeah.
Does that change things now for Europe? And is that an example that we should try to a certain extent to emulate?
Oh, I have to be careful what I say. So I'm trying to be politically neutral on all things U.S. at this moment because of my pro bono project, which involves the U.S. And in fact, on that project, which involves the double taxation of Americans living abroad, Donald Trump is probably the best thing that ever happened to Americans living abroad. But in terms of communications, you got to give it to him. I mean, the guy gets a lot of attention. If you can measure communications by how many column inches you generate and how much airtime you get, he's a master. Whether or not that is ultimately effective is another thing. So I personally believe that communications should be fact-based, and many people would fault President Trump for being a little bit lax on the facts sometimes. He doesn't let the facts get in the way of a good story, as the old journalist adage goes. I would not necessarily advise that approach in Europe. I think NGOs do that. They do manage to get, just like Donald Trump, headlines and airtime by saying outrageous things. But people ultimately will see through the fog.
At the same time, it seems, at least under the last mandate, that NGOs were much more influential than trade associations. And I felt that was partly to do with the fact that they're not always too concerned about playing by the rules or sticking to the facts.
Well, at the top of the podcast, we also talked about some things which the Commission or the EU has done which have fallen on deaf ears. And that was one example which has often led to, or very recently led to a lot of pushback. There were, for example, there's a long-standing tradition practice in which DG Environment would finance environmental NGOs, sometimes to the tune of 50% of their operating budgets in Brussels. And their argument, in their defense was that we've got lots of national NGOs all around Europe, but they didn't have a way to gather at the European level and interact with the European institutions. So the original premise of this subsidy was it was to counterbalance the lobbying that the companies were able to do through their business associations by providing a forum for NGOs to pool their influence in Brussels.
But was money really the factor in that? Like, I mean, surely the industry association should have enough money. It seemed like it was more a difference in approach.
I can tell you from personal experience that there were many campaigns in Brussels that never would have happened because there was no real popular support behind them, if not financed by subsidies from DG Environment. And what's really, really interesting, and I can say from personal experience, is quite often DG Environment was subsidizing NGOs to say things that other parts of the Commission were against. So maybe DG Trade was against it, maybe DG Grow was against it, but the DG Environment would be funding NGOs to beat up the rest of the Commission if they didn't toe the line.
Yeah.
So it's personally, I have a big issue with this. I think it was fundamentally anti-democratic, and now we see after the last two European elections, some politicians have read between the lines and said that this is one of the sources of the public dissatisfaction with the powers that be, and the European People's Party is trying to get rid of these subsidies.
What else do industry lobbies need to do to address this imbalance? Imbalance and influence between NGOs and associations? I
think the European Union already does an amazing job of public consultations. They always invite anybody who has